Hi, everyone. This is Esther Gonzalez from the SHPE staff speaking. We're going to go ahead and give folks a couple more minutes to jump on, and we will get started promptly at 8:05. Thank you. Good evening, SHPE Familia, and welcome to the 2020 Scholarship Webinar Series. We are so excited to present our last scholarship webinar, Wow, What a Letter. As you know, scholarship applications are now open and available by visiting shpe.org, clicking on the student header in the main menu, and then navigating to the scholarship link. The purpose of this webinar is to walk you through what can be an intimidating process, requesting letters of recommendation for your applications. Before we get started, some housekeeping. If you have any questions for us, please feel free to send them through the Ask a Question box. We'll be answering questions at the end of the session if time permits. If we don't get to your question during today's webinar, do not worry. A script with all questions and answers will be posted on our webpage after this webinar has concluded. This PowerPoint deck will also be posted. And lastly, I'd encourage you to share today's webinar with your social networks, including Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter. We want to ensure that everyone has an equal opportunity to submit a Rockstar application to our scholarship program. So without further ado, let's get started. I'm Esther Gonzalez, your moderator and the Scholarship Program Manager. I am your go-to person for any questions you may have regarding our scholarship program. This includes application questions, requirements, and technical issues. I have listed my email on the screen, and you can contact me anytime. But you may find the answer to your question on our scholarship webpage, so be sure to check there first. I have the pleasure of introducing our guest speaker, Dr. Kimberly Douglas-Mankin. Dr. Kimberly Douglas-Mankin is the Director of Programs for SHPE. She has over 25 years of experience as an engineering educator and administrator, developing programs for increasing the persistence and degree completion rates of STEM students with a particular focus on those who are underrepresented and underserved. So we are very lucky to have an industry expert share her knowledge with us today. But before I hand things over to Kimberly, we will conduct a poll to get to know more about you. So we're going to go ahead and launch the first question here. And the question is, what is your current education level? Give folks another 10 seconds to respond here. And closing the poll now. Thank you for responding. Okay, so it looks like 40% of our attendees are in high school, 40% in graduate school, and 20% in their undergrad education level. And the next question we have is whether or not you have applied to our scholarship program before. Looks like we're waiting on a few responses. And I'm closing the poll now. Looks like everyone has voted. So it looks like the majority of our attendees here today have applied to our scholarship program. So we thank you for returning and applying again this year. And hopefully you have found these webinars helpful in preparing your application. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Dr. Kimberly Douglas-Mankin.
Good evening, everybody. A few weeks ago, whenever Esther asked if I was interested in doing this workshop, at first I hesitated, and then I thought about all of the letters that I wrote throughout my career and about the difference between individuals whenever they came in to request those letters and how it set me up to be successful. And whenever I thought about it, and also thinking about reviewing applications, there were times whenever you review applications and you really stop and think, wow, that was quite a letter. And so what we want to do this evening is to share information with you that will help you, put you in a position to be able to have letters that do that for our judges, for our scholarships, and for any other scholarships that you apply for. So this is the agenda that we're going to go through this evening. We're going to talk about the difference that recommendation letters can make, how we can put ourselves in positions where the letter actually says, wow. We're going to talk about whether specific versus general recommendation letters, which one's better and which one's better in which instances. We're going to talk about who you should ask and how to go about asking. And a big piece of that is about being respectful and courteous in that process. We're going to talk about how to follow up after somebody's agreed to be willing to write a letter for you and write a confirmation email. And we're going to talk about how to handle it whenever asking actually turns out to be awkward, and what can you say or what can you do if you sense that maybe you shouldn't have asked that person, and a few other warnings of things that you want to make sure you want to do. We'll wrap up with talking about 4 tips that sort of recap what we've said through the discussion, and then also talk about remembering to say thank you. So that's what our agenda looks like for this evening. Next slide. So first, what difference do recommendation letters really make to your application? They really serve a valuable purpose for the judges or reviewers that will look at your applications, because what they do is they allow your recommender to actually give their own personal firsthand experience with you that can really talk about what makes you unique and distinctive, whether that's intellectually, professionally, or personally. I think about it as though if we look at what you say about yourself in your application, if that's 2 dimensions, it seems as though every letter that the judge or reviewer can read from a recommender actually adds another dimension to your application. And so one of the things we'll talk about a bit more in a bit is how you can select people to try to end up giving your judges or reviewers a complete picture of you and why you're the best candidate to receive the scholarship. Even though you don't write the letter, there are lots of things that you can do to ensure that it's the best that it can possibly be, and that's what we're going to talk about this evening. So as we get started, let me just do one more poll. Do you typically think that a generic letter or a more specific letter is better to go with your application? And Esther, I'll let you decide whenever we're ready.
That was a quick poll. We got 100% results here, and I'm sharing that.
Yeah, everybody agrees with me. So
yay.
Yay. So let's go on to the next slide. So there are actually some experts that recommend that you ask for recommendation letters right after you've built a relationship with someone. And that is really more of the generic letter. One of the rationales for doing that is that sometimes, particularly in the first couple of years of school, you will be in larger class sizes typically. And so the worry is that if you don't ask right away, that they see so many students that maybe later they won't be in the same position to be able to remember you. But faculties are often unwilling to write those generic letters. I had lots of students come and ask for those generic letters. They just wanted me to write them a letter of recommendation. And quite honestly, if the letter ends up being targeted at the specific criteria that are for that scholarship, you'll be in a much better position for it to complement your application in a positive way. And so I always declined to do that, but told them that I appreciated them giving me a heads up that they hope to use me in the future. And usually whenever they came by to do that, I would make a few notes so that if I needed to go back and write a letter for that person, if they really took me up on it, I was in a better position to do that. And so in my opinion, you always want to seek that specific letter rather than use a generic one. Now, the other thing that is also said to be a benefit of that generic one, and might be a reason why you might want to collect maybe 1 or 2 of those if someone were willing to do it, is that if you end up in a situation where you've asked somebody to write a letter of recommendation and at the last minute they realize that they've ran out of time and they can't do it, and you can't get someone else quickly and you need a certain number of letters, it would give you the ability to respond in that case. But I agree with all of you that if we can get that specific letter, that wow letter, your application will be much stronger. Next slide. So next thing I'd like to talk about is who you should ask. And remember, we've said it already and we'll say it more before we're done. The objective of those letters is to strengthen your application. So what you want to do is you want them to end up being really impressed with that additional dimension that the letter provides, to be able to have them better understand why you're the best applicant to receive the scholarship. So great letters come from recommenders who have worked closely with you and know you well, can discuss your accomplishments, either academic or extracurricular, and you'll want to choose the recommender that you ask based on which is more important to the application, who can speak to who you are and what your goals are and how those might align with the scholarship criteria. And those first three things are the obvious things. But the last two are also very important for you to consider, because you want to make sure that the person that you ask to write your letter of recommendation actually has the written communication skills to be able to convey the information that are in numbers 1 through 3. And you may laugh, but you know you've been in the class with the professor or the teacher that is not well organized, or whose slides may have many, many typos on them, or who may not get everything done on time. They always seem to be running behind. Even if you have great experience with that person as an instructor or as a professor, they've got to be able to get their thoughts on paper in order to have the strongest application for you. So you also want to consider their communication skills, and then whether they're a person that's overcommitted, because even if they're the best intended, if they are overcommitted, they may not have the time to set aside to do the job that you would want them to do for the letter. Next slide. So a little bit more about who you should ask. The people that you should consider are professors and instructors, former or current employers. If you've had an internship, maybe an internship supervisor, or other manager at your internship company, maybe your academic advisor, or leaders or advisors of an organization that you're associated with. So if you've been very active in SHPE, your SHPE advisor might be another appropriate person to ask for a letter. You also might consider leaders of community service organizations where you volunteered, or clergy members, or even coaches that you've had in the past, for all different types of either sports or competitions. Next slide. The next slide talks about who not to ask. So typically you do not want to ask family members, that's a never probably, or friends or close friends of your family. You don't want to ask your spouse or your partner. You don't want to ask employers that maybe you left on bad terms. You don't want to ask leaders or advisors of organizations that you joined but then weren't actively engaged in, or maybe where you you didn't actually, you took a leadership role and then you didn't follow through on it. You don't want to ask people who don't know you well. So that would be an example of like a professor that you took a class from, but you never even spoke to. You earned a good grade, but you never visited office hours. You never asked questions in class, and lots of times you were absent. That's not the professor you want to ask. And typically you're not going to ask a therapist. There are a few exceptions. The one that's most obvious is there are certain applications that really want to be able to have somebody that can speak to your character and understand your personality traits. When I've been asked for that type of reference, to give that type of reference for myself or to do it for others, that is a situation where I might agree. And typically I would go in that case to a family friend as opposed to one of my friends, just because the more distance that someone can give, I think the more legitimate the perspective is for that type of a reference. So next slide. So how do you go about making the decision of who to invite? Well, what I'd suggest to you is that you first sit down and develop a list of people that you could ask to do a letter of recommendation. Whenever you make that list, go ahead and collect their names, their address, their email, their phone numbers. Put down how you know them, and also give some thought to and capture what unique perspective you think they could share about you. Because one of the things that you're going to do is, as you go to look at the application requirements might say that might specify that you actually need 2 professors and someone who is a prior employer. But if it doesn't, what you're then going to look at is what the selection criteria are. And whenever you go back and consider how people know you and what unique perspective they have about you, that really lets you make sure that you add those dimensions, as we said earlier, that they can speak to the actual selection criteria that will go into awarding that scholarship. You might also consider their suitability or their reputation with respect to what's important for that particular scholarship. I guess the best example I can think of there is that if you've got somebody that you've taken a class from and you know is involved with SHPE, if you're doing a SHPE scholarship, that person's connection to our organization can potentially add value for you. And so that's an example. But there are other examples, like, for example, if it was a discipline-specific scholarship, you would likely want to have someone do your letter of recommendation that was within that discipline. So those are the types of things I mean by that item. And then, as I said in the prior slide, you also want to consider that person's skills and availability. Do they have the writing skills to be able to convey what they know about you? And are they willing and able to be able to set the time aside? So next slide. So you've made your list, and then you're going to look at it and compare it with the criteria for the scholarship and all of the other things that we had on the last slide, and you're going to make your choice of ever how many people that you need for your letters of recommendation. I don't think I have it on a slide, but if they ask you for 1 to 3 letters of recommendation, I recommend that you do 3. Because again, the more people that can give perspective, the more complete picture the reviewers or the judges have of your application. But once you've decided who you're going to ask, ideally you should ask for the letter in person. And you should do it as early as possible. Whenever I think about what I personally preferred when people were asking me, I wanted about 2 to 4 weeks. And the reason I wanted that much time was that oftentimes as a faculty member, if someone were asking, we have exams scheduled at regular intervals. We have project reports that are due and need to be graded. And so if you give somebody a pretty good sizable amount of time before the letter's due, then they can work it into their workload and they can find the time to be able to do it for you. The other thing that I would say on that timing issue is the more prestigious the scholarship is. So if you were going after a Marshall or a Goldwater scholarship, in that case, you probably want to give them 4 to 6 weeks because the magnitude of the letter they need to be right is even more intense. So you can occasionally, with somebody that you have a strong relationship with, go in and ask for something in a shorter time frame. But whenever you do that, you really want them to know that you doing something on an urgent basis is an exception, and that you're not going to do that to them all the time, because that's not what the impression that you want them to have as they go to write that letter. My recommendation to you is that you use their office hours if at all possible. Or that if it's an employer, that you find a time when you know that person's at work that you could stop by and ask. If it's a matter of getting back into the plant and you don't work there anymore, then that might be a situation where you would use phone versus in person. You also might have asked them to go to coffee though, or something like that. And if the person lives far away, that's another situation where you may want to consider using phone. But in my opinion, your very last resort is to ask via email. You taking the time to go by and meet with them and personally ask, or to connect with them by phone and ask, is really a sign that you value and respect them, and that you're willing to commit the time to make that happen versus just shooting off an email to see if it's feasible. So I definitely encourage you to do that. Next slide. So how do you ask? When you talk with a person, one of the things that I'd say is to be direct and to the point. You don't want to go in and spend 30 minutes visiting and chatting with the person and then act like afterwards that your purpose in being there to ask them to write a letter was an afterthought. And my recommendation is that you start with what you're requesting, that you share why you believe that person was the right person to write a letter, to give them a sense of what you think their unique perspective is that you'd like for them to share as they write the letter, and then to be direct and ask them to do it. So I gave an example here that you can read. I'm applying for a SHPE scholarship to support my plans for college next year. I really enjoyed your class and learned a lot from you. I know that because I initially struggled on your first exam and had to work to earn my grade, that you're in a unique position to speak to my ability to be persistent and not give up. I'd really be honored if you could write a letter of recommendation to support my application. So you can see that I essentially told them what I was going to ask them. I gave them the rationale for why they were the right person, and then I came back and followed with the ask. So next slide. After they agree, what you want to do is you want to follow up with a written confirmation email. Whenever you do that, you want to make sure that you use a descriptive subject line. So it's a recommendation for you. Even if your school is a place where you typically call people by first name, when you go to write this confirmation letter, I would formally address them, Mr. or Mrs. Smith, Ms. Smith, Dr. Rios, whatever the appropriate formal greeting is, that's what I'd recommend you use for that letter. And then what you want to do is you want to use that first paragraph to restate the ask. Make sure that you include information about the due date in that first paragraph. You want to use the second paragraph to describe remind them which classes you've taken from them and why you asked them to write the letter. You want to use the third paragraph to describe the perspective that you're hoping they'll include in their letter, because chances are if you had to choose 2 or 3 or 4 people to write letters, you chose them purposefully to address the various parts of the criteria for the award. And you want to make sure that they understand what perspective you're hoping that they'll bring. You want to provide details. For example, there you're talking about things like, are they writing a letter, or is it a situation where they're going to receive an email and have particular questions that they have to answer for that particular scholarship application? Or if there are any limits on how long the letter could be, or any other details that you have about what they need to do. You want to tell them and share how you plan to follow up. And by that I mean something like, well, I'll touch base again about a week or 2 before the letter's due and see if there's any other information you need from me, something like that. You want to thank them for their willingness to help you. And then you want to attach any related documents for their use. From my perspective, that was likely the most useful thing that an applicant could do in helping me write a letter of recommendation. And that was to provide me with a copy of their current resume and to provide me with a copy of anything that they had said about themselves as a part of this application. So if you've had to write an essay, if you've had to talk about your future goals, if you've had to talk about why your major is the one that you want to pursue, having the recommender understand what you've said about yourself can put them in the best position in order to be able to support the statements that you've made about yourself. So when you go to make that initial ask, if you haven't already done your application, don't wait until you have it done to ask them. Give them a heads up, let them know that you're going to need it. But whenever you write this letter, if you can't attach it right then, tell them that you anticipate having it done in the next week or so, and that you'll get it to them. Make sure that you, and ask if there's anything else that when you're in the office, tell them what you're planning to provide them in your confirmation email, and let you know if there's anything additional that you'd like to that they'd like to have. One of the things that's often recommended is that like for example, if you were giving these to them in paper form, you give a couple of copies of any forms that they might need to use so that they can do a rough draft and then do a clean copy. If you've provided things like that as an attachment, then they have the ability to be in control of what they need and only print what they need. So that's kind of another, we can save a tree along the way. I know I'm not supposed to be not supposed to make a plug for that, but we'll save trees every time we can. Next slide. So what about if it's awkward? A lot of times, what I would say to you is really trust your intuition and your instinct. If you get a sense that they just don't know if they can really write a good letter for you, or maybe it has nothing to do with you. Maybe it's that they're so swamped right now that they just can't afford to take on anything else. So if they're hesitant or evasive or seem uncomfortable or unenthusiastic, consider giving them a way out and asking someone else. And I gave you an example of a way that I might go about doing that if I were asking. I'd say, I know that writing recommendation letters is really time consuming, and that you might not feel like you know me well enough to do it, or that you remember my performance in your class well enough to do it. I'd really be honored to have your recommendation, but I'll also understand and won't take it personally if you need to decline. And just put it out there, and then chances are, if they have been hesitant or if there's something going on, you've given them a graceful out, and that puts you in a good position to be able to maintain the relationship longer term, even if they don't write a letter of recommendation for you. Also, if you get the impression that the person may not have the greatest things to say, it's okay to ask if they feel like they can give you a good recommendation. So again, I gave you an example. It's important to me to put my best foot forward with the scholarship application. Do you believe you'll be able to write a recommendation that'll let me do that? Or should I ask somebody else? And I know that I occasionally had people come into my office that asked for letters where I really didn't feel like that I could give them the best letter. And when they gave me that graceful out, I usually took advantage of it when I needed to. And so just know that if that happens, you don't need to take it personally, because lots of times it's not about you. So next slide. A few other things that I want to make sure that I warn you about. Don't ask for a copy of the letter before it's sent. It's really not customary to be able to see, to ask to see the letters. The other thing is that having a letter that isn't just an open letter that you can see really often carries more weight with reviewers and judges, because they know that recommender has been able to express their true opinion. And so that's a good thing. So a lot of times, even if I was gonna give the person that was doing the application a copy of my letter to read, I would often give them that copy, but then I would put a copy of the letter that they were going to use into an envelope and sign across the seal of the envelope, so that it still carried that weight for the reviewers. So that's always a good thing to have someone do. Remember that the people that you ask aren't obligated to write a recommendation. And so your professors and the professionals that you've worked with in the workplace have often invested decades working really hard to build their reputation. And whenever someone writes you a good, strong letter of recommendation, it's almost like they're putting their stamp of approval on you. And so to some extent, that also then ends up putting their reputation on the line. Because if they've given a recommendation, a strong recommendation, and you don't end up following through on whatever they're recommending you for, it doesn't make them look good. So that's another reason why some people are hesitant to write a lot of letters. And then never, ever, ever list people that you believe will recommend you positively without getting their prior agreement to recommend you. This is important, even if you're confident that you know they'll agree. So my example on that one is that, you know, through the course of my career, I have a set of people that I use when I need references. And if I'm getting ready to do a new application, even if I've seen it last minute and I'm rushing, I've always got emails out to them to get their confirmation before I actually include their name on the list. It's just really good practice and policy to make sure that you do that. Next slide. So to sort of summarize the things that we've talked about this evening, 4 tips for requesting a recommendation letter. Start early, meaning start to think about who you want to use early. And once you know that you're going to ask them, give them a heads up that you'd like to have their help as early as possible, even if you're not ready to hand them the materials right then. But get things in their hand as quickly as you can. Be really purposeful with who you choose as your recommender, thinking about everything we said on that selection slide earlier, but particularly thinking about the criteria that will be used to judge your application. That's probably the most important one from the list. And make sure that you provide them with helpful information. From my perspective, if I were writing your letter, that's what you've said about yourself, and that's a copy of your current resume. And if you make it easy for me and in your confirmation email to me, remind me all of the classes that you took from me, then when I'm writing the letter, I can say that you took 5 classes and I won't have forgotten that you were in one of them. So that's an example of making sure that you're complete. And then always be gracious. Whenever you go into their office and they agree to do it, say thank you. If they say that they can't, tell them thank you for considering the opportunity. When you wrap up the confirmation email, say thank you. And always be kind and gracious through the process. Next slide. So I didn't say more there because I knew it was on the next slide. So remember to say thank you. Writing letters of recommendations takes a significant amount of time, and if they do it well, it takes a lot of thought. So remember to consistently say thank you, as I said just a moment ago. I also recommend, I know it's old school, but I also recommend you considering to do a handwritten thank you after the letter's submitted, because it just says that you're willing to take the time and energy again to make that extra effort. If you don't feel comfortable doing that, an email's okay, but I always remembered the people that wrote notes. And so, and maybe I'm old enough that you think I'm old school, but I think you'd be surprised at the number of younger professionals that would agree with me too. And then remember to celebrate with them and say thank you again whenever you receive the scholarship. They will be so excited to know that you got it and to be able to congratulate you. So make sure that you do that when the process is complete. So with that, next slide. Esther, would you like to tell them a little bit about our process?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Kimberly Douglas-Mankin. It really does help these. I wish I had all of these helpful tips when I was starting college, because I definitely noticed a couple of mistakes that I made throughout the process. So definitely take advantage of these. I just wanted to review quickly some of the recommendation letter logistics. You will submit the recommender's name and contact information through our scholarship application system, Smarter Select, which if you've already started or at least opened our scholarship application, you've already accessed that system. It will ask you for a name and email of your recommender. Please be sure to verify that information several times before you put it into the system, because and that you confirm with your recommender after you've requested, after they've agreed to write your letter and you've submitted their contact information. About a week or so later, please send a follow-up email, or if you have a class with them, just drop in by their office hours or quickly after class, ask and just check if they have received that email, because it happens every year where we're nearing the deadline and people are checking in with me because they're looking at the status of their application online and they see that the recommendation hasn't come through, and it's just so close to the deadline that by the time they double back and contact the professor, it's just a bit too late, and the quality of the recommendation that can be submitted at that point goes down. We've also already received emails asking about if you can submit multiple recommendations or recommenders, and the short answer to that is yes. You can submit multiple contacts with contact info, but the system, well, what I should firstly say is that for fairness, only one recommendation letter will be reviewed by the scholarship review committee. That being said, it automatically selects the first letter that is submitted. So your first recommender to click submit on their end, that's the letter that will be reviewed. If you know that multiple recommenders have submitted letters and you would like to choose for yourself who that recommender is, then make sure that you email us and say, I know that I've reached out to multiple recommenders, but I know that this person has submitted a recommendation and I'd like for this to be the letter to be reviewed, and we can ensure that that is the one that's attached to your application. And this is something that Dr. Kimberly Douglas-Mankin also spoke to. That started early because depending on, it is an online process. And so a lot of these professors spent many years submitting paper letters of recommendations, and they're almost all already familiar with the online process, but they may be used to university platforms or employer platforms and may not be used to our Smarter Select system. So as simple as it is, you want to make sure that you give time for if they have any questions, or if they have any questions for you, for us, or for the system, that we can go ahead and get that taken care of. When in doubt, if you have any questions, if you believe that your professor submitted their letter but it's not showing up on your application status, anything like that, please don't hesitate to contact us. And that's our email there. And as I previously mentioned, my email is on one of the first slides, and this PowerPoint deck will be added to the website as well. So at this point, I'd like to open up the floor for questions. So if you have any questions at all, this is a judgment-free zone. You can ask questions if you've had any types of experiences asking for letters of recommendation and you'd like to ask us. Please don't hesitate to type your question in the question box. So I'll go ahead and give everybody a minute or two to go ahead and submit your question. Okay, so we have our first question. As I apply for more scholarships and need more recommendation letters, is it customary to ask the same people? I almost feel bad asking them to write a new one for each individual scholarship. That's a great question. Dr. Kimberly Douglas-Mankin, do you want to chime in here?
Yeah, I agree. That's a great question. I actually, that second and third letter are actually easier to write. And so one of the things that I would suggest to you is that the person, that recommender, has likely kept their copy of that letter, or even if they wrote something that went into like questions into a system, chances are they kept a copy of it. And so what they'll be able to do is they'll just be able to add anything that's more recent. Writing that second and third and fourth and fifth was easier than the first. So I wouldn't hesitate to ask the same recommender multiple times. Esther, do you have anything to add?
Yes, from the student perspective, and I'll tell you, having done this the wrong way and the right way, what I would say is that this is why that first personal in-person conversation is very important, because that's where you actually tell them what your goal is. So if you're telling this professor, I'm applying to multiple scholarships in hopes of supporting my my junior year of college or my research next year, whatever it may be. And I'd like to request for you to write for this scholarship. You've already kind of set the tone and expectation that you're applying to multiple sources of funding. And so they'll be aware of it. Whereas if you type that out in an email, it may read kind of awkward. And in person, I think is a great time and place to set that expectation.
Yep, I most definitely agree.
Do we have any more questions? Thank you, Elisa, for that question. I think that's definitely a great one. Next question here. As I understood, even if I sent multiple letters, just one letter of recommendation would be read. Is the entire package read by the same person? Yes. So that question is in regards to the logistics here. So yes, even if you submit multiple letters, just one letter of recommendation is read. The entire package is read by a single person, as in each reviewer reviews your entire scholarship application package. However, each application is reviewed by 3 people. So 3 different individuals will read and review your application. So it's not just one person that's reading your recommendation, 3 people are. And I think another thing to note there, if you're if you are applying to multiple scholarships, then you can send different recommenders for each scholarship. That's something to keep in mind as well. And thank you, Maria, for that question.
Also a great question. Let me make sure I heard what you just said, Esther. Within our SHPE system, if they're applying for different scholarships, they could use different recommenders for the different scholarships.
That's correct.
Okay.
All right. Do we have any more questions? Again, take advantage of this time that we're here and available. I'll give folks another minute or 2 to submit any last questions before we wrap up. All right, well, if there are no other questions at this point, we're going to go ahead and conclude our webinar. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Kimberly Douglas-Mankin, for joining us tonight. And as I mentioned to everybody, this webinar is being recorded. It will be posted online. The PowerPoint deck will be posted online, as well as a script with the questions and answers we discussed tonight as well. Thank you, everybody, and you have a good night.
Good night.